Hello, thanks for watching. I really hope you're enjoying the videos. In fact, I've just hit 500 subscribers this weekend, which is amazing. Thank you so much if you're one of them. If you're not yet, why not hit subscribe? Because there's going to be lots more videos coming soon to help you get ready for A-levels. Also, if you know anyone doing GCSE, RS, AQA, lots of new videos coming for that too. But anyway, today, I thought we'd look at virtue ethics, particularly strengths and weaknesses. I really like virtue ethics, but I know that not everyone does, and some people do find it quite confusing when ploughing through the strengths and weaknesses, because there can be a lot of them. Now, I'm not going to do them all in this video because that would just take way too long and it's going to be more than you need. But I'll give you some highlights that hopefully could help you put together an essay. Now, before we get into it properly, there's a couple of reminders that I just want to make sure are super clear. These are mistakes that I see quite a lot when people write about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is very old, and because of that, people assume that it comes from the early days of Christianity. It doesn't. It's from even before that. Aristotle was around in the 4th century BCE. So this is way older even than Christianity. And even though Aristotle probably did have some sort of belief in some sort of god or gods, virtue ethics is a secular ethical theory. That means that it doesn't have overtly religious elements to it. Another way of thinking of it is that an atheist can use it, no problem. So you don't want to say it's a Christian ethical theory. However, that doesn't mean that a Christian can't use it. And if you were writing an essay, particularly a dialogues essay, about the compatibility of Christianity and virtue ethics, you can say, yeah, it can absolutely be used by Christians because it can be adapted and contextualized within a Christian context. For example, Jesus can be seen as a phronimos, a virtuous role model. In terms of comparing it to other ethical theories, virtue ethics is the one that's not like the others. So it's agent-centered, not act-centered. A good way to help you remember that is to think about, rather than thinking, is this action right or wrong? Think, what kind of person would I be if I did this action? It's all about what kind of person are you? So actions themselves aren't judged as being right and wrong. The person doing them is judged as being right or wrong based on what it says about their character if they do or do not do the particular action. And then the end goal is eudaimonia. So this is Aristotle's word. The best translation we have for it is human flourishing, being the best version of yourself, the best you can be. But it's not really connected to ideas about heaven or hell. That's not the aim. So it's not the case that you try to be virtuous in order to go to heaven. That's not the motivation. Aristotle's argument is you try to be virtuous because being the best version of yourself is the entire point of being a person. So an afterlife doesn't really come into it. Again, there's a little bit of a caveat to that, which is that you can incorporate some Christian thinking into it, which is what Aquinas tried to do. Eudaimonia was important to Aquinas as well, but he combined it with this idea of the beatific vision, which is to do with going to heaven. So I get that that can be confusing, but as you're going through and revising, try to make sure that you're clear on what makes virtue ethics distinctive, whilst remembering at the same time that it can be tweaked and adapted to fit with Christianity. All right, let's look at some strengths and weaknesses then. So the way I'm going to do this is we're going to take 4 of each. So I'm going to talk you through 4 strengths and 4 weaknesses. Like I say, there are a lot more than that. And if you're going through your textbook, your notes, your revision guide, whatever you're using, you'll definitely find more than 4. But I'm trying not to overload you. I'm just trying to give you some ones that I think are nice and clear and straightforward that you could use in an essay without too much problem. So here we go. Character is a better basis for morality than duty. So virtue ethics is based on character. It's based on improving you as a person. And the whole idea behind it is that if you take a virtue-centered approach to all your moral decisions, you will develop positive character traits. So by practicing generosity, you become generous. And eventually you'll be generous without even having to think about it. So the reason this is a strength is you could argue that's a lot more valuable than just doing something because it's a rule or doing something because you're told it's a duty. So this is an example that I quite like that can be useful. So imagine you've got an elderly neighbour. You might visit them because you think it's the right thing to do. You might visit them because you've been brought up to believe it's the right thing to do. You might go and visit them because somebody's made a rule that you live by that says you ought to take care of elderly relatives. But if you're doing it only for those reasons, yeah, you're still going to be doing it. But is that as good morally as visiting them because you're genuinely a compassionate, generous, kind person who actually wants to visit them and who genuinely cares? Now, you could say it doesn't matter because the end result is the same, but I think you could reasonably argue that the virtuous approach is better there. Virtue ethics is therefore holistic. It's an all-around way of doing ethics. It's not constrained by rules. It's not solely motivated by outcomes. It's about you as a person. Secondly, and kind of following on from this, with virtue ethics, you're genuinely free to be good. So again, this is, I suppose, having a little bit of a pop at a rule-based theory such as natural moral law, arguing that virtue ethics can be better. So similarly to natural moral law, actually, virtue ethics gives human reason an important role to play because virtue ethics recognises that you've got to figure things out for yourself, but it also recognises that not every situation is the same. And natural moral law isn't very good at that. Natural moral law, particularly the Catholic manualist version of natural moral law, becomes very, very rule-based. So again, I've got an example here. A virtuous person can work out that using contraception to prevent the spread of AIDS is good, is virtuous. People are better off if you do that. But this would not be permitted by the rules of natural moral law because working from the primary precepts to the secondary precepts, we end up with a rule that contraception is bad. And there might be cases where it is, but this isn't one of them. And virtue ethics gives you that freedom to figure out that actually not every situation is the same. This is what we call phronesis. This is your practical wisdom, one of the most important virtues. So it allows you to genuinely develop because it lets you be flexible and it understands that even the golden mean is a little bit wiggly. It's not always the same for everybody in every way. The problem with natural moral law, just to do a contrast, is that if you follow the rules, yeah, great, you're probably doing the right thing. But are you really growing as a person? Are you really becoming better? In virtue ethics, the argument is that when you do virtuous things, you become more virtuous. So you are developing, you are changing, you are becoming better, you are moving towards eudaimonia. Now this one is more about society. So everyone is better off if everyone acts virtuously. Now you could also say, well, everyone's better off if everyone follows the rules, but there are problems with that. So if everyone works on developing the virtues, ultimately everybody will be better off because everybody will be focused on becoming a better, more rounded, more virtuous person with all these really good character traits. And the example I've got here is a little bit of business ethics, which we don't really do, but it can work quite nicely for this. If you embed virtue into areas such as business practice, It ultimately leads to fairer, more successful societies that take a long-term view. So the most successful businesses in the long term tend to be, yes, ones that make a profit, but also ones that don't exploit their employees, ones that care about the environment, ones that give back to their communities, that do virtuous things. And the argument here is, actually, if everybody was like that, we'd all be much better off. And here we can slightly criticise consequentialist ethics or teleological ethics. So the example I'm going to use here is utilitarianism, but you could equally do it with situation ethics. They might sometimes take a short-term view instead of a long-term view, whereas virtue ethics is very much playing the long game. For example, utilitarianism might lead to a focus on profit because that's the greatest good for the greatest number, that ignores the long-term environmental or social costs of doing business. And that's not good. Okay, final strength for us. Virtue ethics is realistic and allows us to grow. It accepts that sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes we're going to make mistakes, but that's okay because a mistake is an opportunity to learn and be better. So virtue ethics, like I said before, it plays the long game. It takes the view that human life is a journey in a way that other ethical theories don't. Other ethical theories tend not to take this long-term view. It recognises that things that you have to work for are valuable. Are you really generous or kind or compassionate if that's just programmed into you from birth? Or is it more valuable if you earn it? This is definitely arguing that the latter is true. It allows you to learn from your mistakes. It allows you to overcome bad experiences to become a better, more rounded person. Deontological ethical theories tend to just tell you you're wrong if you break the rules. But if you make a mistake in virtue ethics, it's like, well, okay, you've made a mistake, you're human. What can you learn from this? How can you be better? How can you move forward? And it fits actually quite well, and this is where you can make it a little bit Christian compatible, with John Hick's soul-making view. Maybe the purpose of life is about overcoming difficulties to become a better person. So there's a connection you can make there. Okay, so there's some strengths. Let's talk about the problems. Now, before I get into this, it's worth bearing in mind that what could be a strength for one person could equally be interpreted as a weakness for another. So just to make that super simple, on the one hand, virtue ethics is very flexible and very open to interpretation. But we could take that exact same point and say, well, that's a weakness because it also means that virtue ethics is vague. So you can do that, but also we've got a few more to look at here as well. So people often lack the strength to be virtuous. This is hard to argue against because even though we know what we ought to do, we know how to be better people, we can't always be bothered. We don't always have the moral strength to do that. So people might want to be virtuous, but when presented with a situation where they actually have to do something hard, they might just go with the flow. And the example here I've got is Milgram's study. Now you can look this up, but the short version of it is this was an experiment where people were being told to give electric shocks to other people that they couldn't see because a doctor, what they perceived as a doctor in a white coat, was telling them to do it. And they could hear the participants screaming in pain, and they kept being told to increase the level of electric shock. And some people refused to do it, but lots of people didn't. Lots of people just kept giving the shocks until they were basically fatal, even though none of this was real, because they were being told to by an authority figure. So that shows us that even though we want to do the right thing, sometimes it's just easier not to. Now, we might have a few Donald Trump fans watching, but I'm going to use this example anyway. Going with the flow, lacking the strength to be virtuous, lacking the strength to say, actually, that's not the best thing to do, can lead to dangerous behaviour. So lots of people who stormed the Capitol January the 6th, 2021, they said, oh, it was what the president wanted. The president told us to do it. But surely a truly virtuous person would think for themselves. And yet they didn't. And they still believed that they were right. So this suggests that even those who see themselves as good and virtuous and in the right can be very, very easily manipulated. And so that's a danger of virtue ethics. Big problem as well is that it can collapse into what we call moral relativism. So this is the idea that some people think certain things are right, some people think the opposite is right, and we can't really decide between them. So if we can't agree on what's virtuous, how do we know when people are really getting it right? How do we recognise and celebrate virtue when we see it? So we can take an example out of the Christianity section of the course and look at pacifism. Some people see it as very brave, noble, one of the most virtuous things you can do, to die for your country. But a pacifist might not see that as virtuous at all and think that actually a far more virtuous thing to do is to pursue a non-violent means of solving problems. Now, there's no obvious way out of that. There's no clear solution. So it is a bit of a problem. Thirdly, going back to a point I made earlier, virtue ethics is too open to interpretation and it can be used for evil purposes. So it can be twisted and distorted. So if what's virtuous is debatable, then it can be, like I say, twisted to suit all kinds of different viewpoints, some of which may be harmful. So if we take something like bravery, I think we'd all argue that bravery is a virtue. Now, a suicide bomber may be incredibly brave, which is a virtue, but that doesn't mean that their action is virtuous. So just having the virtue doesn't necessarily mean you'll use it for good. So British philosopher Philippa Foot, whom you may have heard of, she's right when she points out that an action which lacks a good will cannot be virtuous. So she's arguing that the suicide bomber can't be virtuous because they don't have a good will. But what if the suicide bomber genuinely believes that the people he is killing are legitimate targets? What if he genuinely believes he's doing the right thing? The point here is it's very, very easy to manipulate the concept of virtue. It's very vague, it's very woolly, and that opens up big problems. And then the last one, this is a problem with Aristotle himself and the society that he came up in. It's also a problem with virtue ethics being very, very old. This theory was devised in a world and a society that's utterly different to where we are now. So he was one of the most privileged members of his society. So he wrote this theory for people like him, which would certainly not be everybody. He lived in a society where slavery was normal, women were thought to be incapable of being educated. Now, if these were his starting points, it's fair to say, can we really apply this thinking to problems today? Now, some people say, yeah, we can, because all we have to do is update it and adapt it a little bit, but it's still got its issues. And the same problem exists today in a different way. Aristotle was very, very lucky. Not everybody is that lucky. What if you don't have great teachers, great parents, great moral role models to show you how to be virtuous? How are you supposed to learn? So it's kind of making the point that it's easy to be virtuous if you've got lots and lots of advantages going for you already. But if you don't have those advantages, it puts you behind and doesn't give you a clear way of catching up. Okay, so that's my 4 strengths, 4 weaknesses for you. I've given it you as a little table there. What you might want to do is maybe make your own version of this table and add in any more that you find so that you've got maybe 7 or 8 on each side. And then you can decide as part of your revision which is going to be the 3 or 4 that you really, really learn in depth so that you could use them in an essay. I don't think you would ever need a level of detail where you're talking about 8 or 9 different strengths or weaknesses, But if you know 3 or 4 really, really, really well, I'd argue that that's better, and that's going to make for better essays. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. Keep working hard. Keep requesting videos, because I'm hoping to make some more very soon. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you soon.